again for joining us on Searching for Answers. My name is Carolyn Thompson, and on my right is
John Jones, La Sierra University.
John Brunt, the Azure Hills Church.
And Ivan Blazin, Loma Linda University.
Ivan. You were telling us a personal story that we didn't get to hear the end of, and I'm sure our viewers are saying, I want to hear the rest of the story. So,
well, you're
go
very
ahead.
kind. You're very kind to allow me to tell this story. Well, we were in this story in Luke 21
Yes.
of the widow, poor widow, it says, who, in contrast to those who were rich putting in some of their money into the treasury, why, she put in 2 mites, which was everything that she had. And Jesus, you know, obviously commends her. They gave out of their abundance. She gave out of her poverty. Okay, so there's the story. And I had a sort of a match-up story talking about the time when my father went back to his native country of Croatia and never came back on the plane where my brother was expecting him to come. He had had a massive heart attack in Yugoslavia. I didn't know that. My brother didn't know that. And a couple of days went by and I had to find out. So I called up the capital of Croatia, Zagreb, and I called up the United States Embassy.
Can you speak that language?
Well, just a little bit. My father never spoke it in the home, and so that's been a lifelong wish that I had that I could understand. I understand some words and so on because my grandmother, when I'd go to her home,
Sure.
in Buffalo, New York from Detroit, why, I would learn words, all kinds of words for spoons and forks and foods and other kinds of things, you know. Well, anyway, so I waited a few days and I called up and I got this very gentle, tender woman's voice on the other end of the line. I said, you know,
This is the U.S. Embassy.
At the U.S. Embassy. Now, the one I got on the other end was a Yugoslav native. Yugoslavia was a country then, it's not now, but it was in Croatia. Very tender sounding, Yugoslav native who spoke perfect English. And when she heard, you know, that my father never came home, she was very much touched by this. And she began to sympathize, you know, with this and all. And then she said, we will look for your father and I will call you back. So she called back and said, your father is very, very, very critically ill in the hospital and so on. And she began to compassionately give me some consolation and so on. Oh my, this was quite a person. So when I got over there, I wanted to meet her.
Sure.
And I got a chance to meet her. And we talked a little bit about everything. And then a couple of days into the trip, she called me up at my hotel and she said, Mr. Blazin, would you please come to the embassy? So I came. And what she was going to say to me was remarkable. She said, Mr. Blazin, I've been thinking about something, and here's what I would like to do for you, your family, your father. It's going to cost a lot of money to take your father home again, and she meant when he died. And he did die there. And so I've been thinking about it, and what I'd like to do is I would like to give you, I'd like to put into your hands my life savings, which were in a German bank. She had 2,000 German marks. 2,000. In this story you have 2 mites. She has 2,000 German marks, the number 2. And she said, I'm not doing this primarily for your sake. She was a little Catholic lady. But I'm doing it for the sake of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has done so much for us. And at this, I'm really getting knocked out. And then I said, and then she said, and I'm not doing it to win God's favor, but only to express gratitude for the favor he has already shown. And I thought, here's an explanation of righteousness by faith. That's exactly what I believe is true. And then I said, I couldn't take it anymore. I said, you are some kind of Christian, some kind of Christian. And she bowed her head, wagged it back and forth, saying, no. She said, no, I'm not. She said, my husband has treated me badly and tried to hurt me, and I have felt enmity toward him. And no true Christian ever feels enmity toward another person. Then I knew she was a Christian, because she had a continuing sense of the reality of our lives, our imperfect lives. But she was going to give me that. Now, I never took it. We never took it. We were able to bring my father home, and he did indeed die, as I said. But I can't ever forget a woman to this man, a stranger lying in the road, like in the parable of the Good Samaritan, who was just going to place at my disposal for our use all of that to help us transport my father back. And I think today, now this person is so commendable in the sight of God. How could you, ever think of anything higher than that? She was going to give all. That was her whole thing, like this widow right here. So I had to say it because I thought of it as soon as this story was told.
Never heard you tell that before.
You never did? Well, it's quite a story. There are lots of other details to that story that are truly remarkable, but she is one of the, and she was one of the, she's a Catholic saint in my opinion. She knows God. She knows the righteousness of Christ. She has things in the right order, and she's willing to commit everything she has for the help of other people. Now that's really something. So,
very beautiful story. Continuing on, according to Barclay, that in Jesus' time, there was a court for the women when they went to the synagogue. Is that right?
The temple.
Temple. Okay, in the court of the women in the temple, there were 13 collecting boxes known as trumpets. They were shaped like trumpets with the narrow part at the top and the wider part at the bottom. Each was assigned to offerings for a different purpose: for the wood that was used to burn the sacrifice, for the incense that was burned on the altar, for the upkeep of the golden vessels, and so on. It was near the trumpets that Jesus was sitting. So you see, after the strenuous debates with the emissaries of the Sanhedrin and the Sadducees, he was tired, and maybe his head drooped just a little, and he looked up and saw this dear lady, like the lady that you're talking about, who gave 2 mites, which was all she had. Now, do you think someday we'll meet that lady in person when we get to heaven? And I think you'll meet your lady.
I'm going to meet my lady.
That's right, when you get to heaven, because those are generous people, both women who were doing what they thought. I mean, I'm sure the lady who was helping you didn't think she was a good Christian. She probably thought she could be a lot better. And I'm sure the little widow was feeling, well, I'm not doing a very good job. I'm only giving 2 little coins, and that isn't much.
Yeah.
But I'd like to give them anyway. So when you kind of use your imagination, and it just, you can just see her kind of going up to the little box and putting it in, and into the trumpet. That's what they called it. So I thought that was very interesting.
Well, who would have noticed it? Noticed that Jesus notices it.
Yeah.
And Jesus takes real note and has real regard for it. And in effect, he has given us something here which lasts throughout all the centuries of time.
That story has come down all these centuries. You're
Yeah.
right, Ivan.
You know,
That's
some
a-
people who are great hardly become a footnote in history. And this little lady is more than a footnote.
And then there are some people who can afford to give, and they give lots, but they have plenty left over.
Yes,
So
it says they
it's-
give of their excess.
Yes,
If you notice the
yes.
story.
Give of their excess. And that's true. All these people gave their gifts out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in all she had to live on. Beautiful story.
And can't we make another little lesson from it? That in giving Christ, God gave all he had too.
Yes.
He gave the fullest, biggest, most comprehensive gift he
Right.
could have ever given.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
he's the supreme illustration of this very thing.
Right.
You know, literally, the word in that verse, it's in 21:4. No, 21:5. Let's see here. Be sure I'm good. 4, 21:4. Yes. The rich gave out of their overflow. That's really the word.
Yes.
That which, if you pour a cup full and don't stop pouring, that which flows out over. So, yeah, that's a dramatic contrast, isn't it? One of the interesting things about this story is that even among peoples who don't know much about Jesus, this particular story is well known among Muslims. I've heard it referenced by Buddhist monks and priests, various religions around the world. I've heard it referenced in China. This particular story catches people's attention, even if they don't know much else about Jesus. They know this story.
Isn't that something? Yeah.
Well, something hits us right in
Yeah,
here.
right.
You almost get a tear in your eye.
And if not, we should.
Yes, that's right.
That's right.
Now we're going to continue on, and we're going to, according to what my Bible says, a heading, Signs of the End of the Age.
Yeah.
John Jones, would you begin reading on
Well,
21
this
verse
is
5?
a contrast. I mean, we've got this poor widow, and the very next verse says the temple is adorned with all this beautiful semi-precious stones and votive gifts and things. So we do have a contrast here, don't we? This chunk of Luke 21 is corollary to a piece of the New Testament that is very well known by most of our viewers, Matthew 24. This is simply the Lucan version of the same thing, looking forward to last day events and signs of the kingdom. So here we go, verse 5, and we'll take it down a little bit. We won't go through all through the chapter at this point. This happens to be, this time I think I have the New American Standard Bible. Verse 5 of Luke chapter 21. And so, while some were talking about the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and precious votive gifts, he says, "As for these things that you are looking at, in the days will come when there will not be left one stone upon another which will not be thrown down." And they questioned him, saying, "Teacher, then when, therefore, will these things happen? And what will be the sign when these things are about to take place?" And he said, he comes back with a caution. Isn't this interesting? Rather than answering the question directly. Verse 8, he said, see to it that you are not misled. Many will come in my name, saying, I am he. The time is near. Don't go after them. When you hear of wars and disturbances, do not be terrified. Stirred up is kind of the idea of the original there. These are things that must take place first, but the end does not follow immediately. So on the one hand, there's a warning of this coming, but when the students, the disciples, try to anticipate this, the answer is deflecting, isn't it? It's kind of holding them off a little bit.
That's
it's a
right.
warning against not getting stirred up about this stuff. Isn't that interesting?
Absolutely. And it has so often been taken exactly the opposite
that's
way.
right.
Exactly.
Instead of understanding what Jesus is saying. That he's saying, don't get all bent out of shape when you see these people with rumors, and when you see wars and you see earthquakes and so forth. These are the kind of things that are going to happen in the world.
But
the
he
end
did
isn't
say,
yet.
watch out.
Yes, watch
He did
out.
say, watch out, that you are not deceived.
And that's the main warning, that you not be deceived
That's right.
by people who
Saying-
are trying to
Who are
tell
whipping you up.
or that are whipping you up. You know,
That's a good way to
this
put it.
is this is so much needed, not only when Jesus said it, but now as well. I have just this spring had people in my office setting dates. They had it all figured out.
Oh, yeah.
You know, one was just a few days ago. It passed, but they were sure, and that I needed to tell my congregation because this was coming up, you know, in just a few weeks, and people needed to know how close it was, and that he knew the date, and well, it passed last week.
Have you considered going back to these folks and saying, what if I had done what you said?
Yeah, they just say, well, I'm restudying and I'll be in touch.
Yeah.
But
I'm not mocking these sincere
No.
believers in many
That's
Christian
right.
faiths and denominations around the world. But it's, remember the Y2K furor,
Oh,
which is
yes.
now already
That's right.
receding into our
Yes.
rear view mirrors of our memory. But that was a real uproar at the time, wasn't it?
And I think there's another consideration here. Not just that Jesus warns us against time setting, I mean, that's a big point. But the original question that is asked by the disciples, see, Jesus prophesies that the temple in Jerusalem, the Jerusalem temple of the first century will be overthrown.
And the Jew says, well, when is this going to happen?
Yeah, and when
They
is
were
this?
horrified, don't you think?
Well, yes, but when is the temple going to be destroyed?
Yes.
See, now, the point is that all of these things, if you read down the line of the Gospel of Luke or Mark or Matthew, all of these things happen, and then finally comes the destruction of the temple. But all of these things are preceding the destruction of the temple. However, in the mind of anybody, if the temple is destroyed,
Yeah.
I mean, that's the bastion of God's presence.
Yeah.
When the temple is destroyed, then the end will be. I mean,
And in Matthew, you get that more, don't you?
In
Because the
Matthew, you
disciples
get it.
ask the question, when will this be and what will be the signs?
It's all one
And
piece
it's all
of
one to
business.
them. I mean, they can't imagine that the temple could be destroyed and the world would go on.
Exactly.
I mean,
So
that's
we
not
have a
question.
kind of mingling of these two things. Ellen White speaks of a mingling of the destruction of Jerusalem with the end of the world.
And tells us that in Jesus' mercy, he did not pull them apart at that point. The disciples couldn't handle it. So he answers them on the level on which they ask the question. But that leaves us with a task of discerning a little more, doesn't
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
It is kind of a dual prophecy.
it? Yes.
Well, in a way it is.
Yes.
Actually, in the outline, first part is about the destruction of the temple, which in Matthew's, just before that happens, and this gospel shall be preached to every nation, and then shall the end come, and that's the end of the temple. But we know it's going to be more than that. The two things are kind of
Yeah.
fused there in the picture.
And he replied, watch out that you are not deceived, for many will come in my name claiming, I am he, and the time is near. Do not follow them. When you hear of wars and revolutions, do not be frightened. These things must happen first, but the end will not come right away. Does that mean we can all just kind of heave a sigh of relief?
Well,
Or
yeah.
what does that mean?
Well, you know, there's-
Then he said
excuse me.
Yeah. Then he said to them, nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, famines, pestilences in various places, and fearful events and great signs from heaven. But before all this, they will lay hands on you and persecute you. They will deliver you to synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors, and all on account of my name. Okay, now, is he going back and forth here for the time of the disciples, or is he talking about both, the end of time and when he goes back to heaven?
Well, it
So-
may be both. Interestingly enough,
Yeah?
when he says what you just read, namely that they will hand you over to synagogues and prisons, the first part of the book of Acts
Yeah.
talks precisely about handing over the early disciples to synagogue, to prisons.
Really?
Yeah, and then you'll be brought before kings, and then at the end of the Acts is this being brought before kings. This almost is like an outline of the book of Acts in a way.
That's right.
Interestingly enough.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay,
But this is about
John Brunt.
persecution, isn't it?
would you continue reading there where I left off, please?
Let's see, which verse did you leave off, Carolyn?
Well, you can go to verse 12.
Verse 12, okay. But before all this, they will lay hands on you and persecute you. They will deliver you to synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors, and all on account of my name. This will result in your being witnesses to them. But make up your mind not to worry beforehand how you will defend yourselves.
Isn't that interesting?
Yes, for
Keep
I
going.
will give you words and wisdom that none of your adversaries will be able to resist or contradict. You will be betrayed even by parents, brothers, relatives, and friends, and they will put some of you to death. All men will hate you because of me, but not a hair of your head will perish. By standing firm, you will gain life.
Yeah.
Now, isn't this interesting that it all happens because of the name of Jesus?
Yes.
Because they witness to the name of Jesus?
And it's interesting that he says they will betray you,
Yeah.
all will hate you, but then he says not a hair of your head will perish.
But
And yet
that's
some of
not-
them
Yeah,
are put
we're
to death.
persecuted.
Yeah.
Yeah. How do you explain that?
That's an interesting thing. Some of you will be put to death, but not a hair of your head
It
will
will
be.
be. See now, what's original Greek say?
Well, it's the
It's
same
the same
thing.
thing.
Yeah,
Mhm.
same
Yeah,
thing.
this is not a place where the Greek helps. It's
No.
just
It isn't?
straightforward.
Well, could it be? Does anybody have it in italics? If you see something in italics in some of the Bibles, it
That's
King
tells you
James,
that
King
that
James.
things
that
this
was
is
added to fill out the thought.
Yes.
Yeah.
That is true, but again, yeah, in italics,
Well, in
verse
this case,
16,
it's
some
all
of you
there.
to death in the New American Standard.
Oh,
The
really?
some of you is italicized. But,
Okay.
But
Maybe-
that's taking from the genitive case in Greek.
Now maybe if we draw some this sounds pretty tough. This is a time of persecution, right? But it's interesting that you'll be brought before kings, and this will give you an opportunity
That's right.
to testify, so that even the worst of times,
Yeah.
in a sense, can be the best of times for giving witness to the gospel. See,
What author said? It was the best of
I
times.
know.
It
I
was
know.
the worst of times.
That was Dickens, wasn't it?
Yes, Charles Dickens.
I was going to say Ivan the somebody.
Yeah. No, not that Ivan.
But you see what's happening here. You're right. It's a time of persecution, but it's an opportunity for witness. And when we compare Matthew and Mark, they don't quite have it that way. In Mark especially, but also in Matthew a little, there's a certain kind of breathlessness about the whole thing. It's right there. Only in Luke now, coming later than Mark and later than Matthew, we believe, do we begin to get space to breathe. Now, it's space with persecution, to be sure, but it's space of a time to bear witness. Luke is beginning to pull apart and open up a little separate chapter in the history of the human race that we don't see in Mark. I mean, it's all right there, collapsed. So, in fact, when we skip down, if we will, just briefly for the moment, to verse 24, you'll be captive to all the nations. Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles is completed. There's no such notion in either Mark or Matthew. Here is Luke opening up a space that has its own being. It stands on its own feet. There's a period, a span in here that Luke is putting in. Isn't it interesting that enough time has gone by that the experience of the church with the delay, if they felt it to be a real delay of the second coming, is beginning to make them edgy? Luke's solution, it seems to me, is to call our attention to this saying of Christ, which kind of creates a moment in time, which moment now is filled in with his second volume. The idea of how this outlines the very stages in Luke is exactly right. Luke knows exactly what he's doing here.
And I think we have, more things to go through, but when you get toward the end, just a brief note on the end of the dissertation Jesus is giving, which starts in 34 to 36, I think that's really the point of the whole thing, which kind of fits in with, and we'll get there. Be on guard so that your hearts are not weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and the worries of this life, and that day catch you unexpectedly. So I think that's where it's going. And of course, Luke's readers are listening to all this. I mean, as they read and hear this, this kind of thing, I think they'll see it in their time.
Exactly.
That just ahead comes the coming of Christ, and we're being exhorted to not lose our perseverance here, to be diligent.
It's kind of a double warning, isn't it? Let's not have drunkenness and dissipation on the one hand.
Yes.
And on the other hand, don't get all stirred up and excited in some sensational way.
That's right.
Rather, this is a call to steady maturity, isn't it, in the Christian walk?
That's right.
Seems to me.
In the
Yes.
midst of difficulty.
Exactly
In the
so,
midst of difficulty.
Yeah, in the face of hardship. My nurse wife tells me none of us can live forever on adrenaline. And neither can the church. We need to settle down, have some theological, doctrinal beans and potatoes, you know? Yeah.
Isn't it, there's one other thing we haven't talked about in this paragraph I just read.
Okay, go ahead.
And that is that he says when you're persecuted, don't think in advance. Don't figure out what you're going to say in
Yes,
advance.
that's a
It'll be
good
given to
point.
you at the
Interesting.
time.
Yes,
Isn't that
don't worry about
interesting? I've had
Yeah.
some preaching
Yeah,
students
homiletics.
who thought that this applied to sermon preparation as well.
Well, when
I'm not convinced.
Well, when I was teaching in college, a lot of students began to have a revival, and this was one of their texts that they said, now the thing about it is, let us make no preparations whatsoever for what we're going to say when we go into the churches. It'll all be given us. And so I have a feeling, you know, I'm glad God will guide us, and yet at the same time, I feel like we need to think, we need to study Scripture, we need to meditate on things and so on.
Yes.
Maybe that's the atmosphere in which
The Spirit can work.
the Spirit can work. Yeah, exactly.
Well, we have about a minute left.
Okay.
And I just want to say that I agree that you're not supposed to worry ahead of time and so forth and so on. But it's hard not to be a little concerned. But I think I've kind of resolved it in my own mind. If you're called up to testify or something, don't worry, because God says, you know, you've studied, you know what you believe, you know what I've taught you. Don't worry about it. And when you get there, I will bring it to your mind what you should say. Now that's how I've interpreted. Maybe
Well,
I'm,
the Gospel of John says that very thing. The Spirit will bring to your mind all things that I've told you.
yeah, that you've studied. So you can't just go in there and say, well, I don't know anything, so, but the Lord will take care of me. He'll help me. You've got to study ahead of time as best you can. And now we have 7 seconds. And I think I'm going to have to say this is all we have for this time. Until next time, this is Carolyn Thompson.